Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our second meeting for the purposes of our study on privacy and social media. It is my pleasure to welcome Ms. Scassa, Mr. Geis, and Ms. Steeves this morning, all three from the University of Ottawa, and who will all be giving us opening remarks of 10 minutes each. There will then be a period of questions where we'll have an opportunity to ask you questions on your opening remarks. So with no further delay, I will ask the first person to take the floor. Perhaps we'll go from left to right. Ms. Scassa. Thank you very much for your invitation to speak to you today. I will be giving my opening remarks in English. However, I would be pleased to answer any questions you may have in English or French.
Very important that more attention be given to data protection and privacy in relation to the activities of social media companies. I do find it somewhat ironic that the committee's mandate was framed in terms of studying the efforts and measures taken by social media companies to protect the personal information of Canadians. It's a bit like studying the efforts made by foxes to protect the lives of chickens. I note to the extent that Google, Facebook, and other social media companies attempt to protect the personal information of Canadians, these efforts have been shaped by data protection law. The adequacy of our data protection legislation must therefore be a focus of attention. The amendments from the first 5-year review of 2006 have yet to make it through Parliament. The second 5-year review is already late in getting underway. These should be matters for concern, particularly since the data protection environment has changed substantially since the law was first enacted. The current law is particularly weak with respect to enforcement. The Commissioner has no order-making powers and lacks the ability to impose fines or other penalties in the case of particularly egregious conduct. The focus on social media and privacy, in my view, has two broad aspects. The first relates to how individuals use these tools to communicate amongst themselves. In this regard, we hear concerns about employers accessing Facebook pages, people posting the personal information of other people online, criminals exploiting Facebook information, and so on. These are concerns about the information that individuals have chosen to share, the consequences of that sharing, and the norms that should govern this new mode of interpersonal exchange. The second aspect, and the one on which I'll focus my attention, is the role of these companies in harvesting or in facilitating the harvesting of massive amounts of information about us in order to track our online activity, consumption habits, and even patterns of movement. In this respect, attention given to large corporations such as Facebook and Google is important, but there are also many other players in the digital environment who are engaging in these practices. The business models of social media companies are generally highly dependent on the personal data of their users. In fact, social networking, search engines, email, and many other services are offered to us for free. By hosting our content and tracking our activities, these services are able to extract a significant volume of personal data. The nature and quality of this data is constantly enhanced by new innovations. For example, information about the location and movements of individuals is highly coveted personal information. More and more individuals carry with them location-enabled smartphones, and they use these devices for social networking and other online activities. Even computer browsers are now location-enabled, and thus information about our location is routinely gathered in the course of ordinary Internet activities. The point is that more and more data of increasingly varied kinds are being sought, collected, used, and disclosed. This data is compiled, matched, and mined in order to profile consumers for various purposes, including targeted behavioral marketing. In some cases, this data may be shared with third-party advertisers, with application developers, or with related companies. Even where the data is de-identified, its fine-textured nature may still leave individuals identifiable, as companies such as AOL and Netflix have learned the hard way. Individuals may also still be identifiable from detailed profile information, and the substantial volumes of information gathered about us make us highly vulnerable to data security breaches of all kinds. It's become very difficult to protect our personal data, particularly in contexts where privacy preferences are set once and often by default, and the service is one which we use daily or even multiple times each day, and Facebook or a search engine would be examples of those. It's often difficult to determine what information is being collected, how it's being shared, and with whom. Privacy policies are often too long, unclear, and remote for anyone to actually read and understand. We now enter into a myriad of transactions every day, and there simply isn't time or energy to properly manage our data. It's a bit like walking through a swamp and being surrounded by a cloud of mosquitoes. To avoid being bitten, we can swat away, we can use insect repellents or other devices, but in the end, we're inevitably going to be bitten, often multiple times. It's also becoming increasingly difficult to avoid entering the swamp. People use social media to keep family and friends close, regardless of how far apart they live, or because the social network communities have become a part of how their own peer groups communicate and interact. Increasingly, businesses, schools, and even governments are developing presences in social media, which give even more impetus to individuals to participate in these environments. Traditional information content providers are also moving to the internet and to Facebook and Twitter, and are encouraging their readers, listeners, and viewers to access their news and other information online in interactive formats. These tools are rapidly replacing traditional modes of communication. To date, our main protection from the exploitation of our personal information in these contexts has been data protection law. Data protection laws are premised on the need to balance the privacy interests of consumers with the needs of businesses to collect and use personal data. But in the time since PIPEDA was enacted, this need has become a voracious hunger for more and more data retained for longer and longer periods of time. The need for data has shifted from information required to complete particular transactions or to maintain client relationships, and has changed to a demand for data as a resource to be exploited. This shift risks gutting the consent model on which the legislation is based. This new paradigm deserves special attention and may require different legal norms and approaches. Under the traditional data protection model, the goal was to enable consumers to make informed choices about their personal data. In the big data context, informed choices are very difficult to make. Beyond this, there's an element of servitude that's deeply disturbing. Nancy Obermeyer uses the term volunteer geoslavery to describe a context where location-enabled devices report on our movements to any number of companies without us necessarily being aware of this constant stream of data. She makes the point that equipping individuals with sensors that report on their activities leaves them vulnerable to dominance and exploitation, yet this is a growing reality in our everyday lives. Going beyond the simple collection of data, social networking services encourage users to make these sites the hub of their daily activities and communications. Our personal data is a resource that businesses large and small regularly exploit. The data is used to profile us so as to define our consumption habits, to determine our suitability for insurance or other services, to apply price discrimination in the delivery of wares or services. We become data subjects in the fullest sense of the word. There are few transactions or activities that do not leave a data trail. As noted earlier, many so-called free services such as social networking sites, document sharing sites, cool apps, and even internet searching are actually premised on the ability to extract user information. In the 2011 decision of the Quebec Superior Court in Saint-Arnaud and Facebook, a judge refused to certify a class action lawsuit against Facebook. To do so would have required classifying the terms of use for the site as a consumer contract so that Quebec law could override the clause that provided that all disputes would be settled under the laws of California and in California courts. The Quebec court found that there was no consumer contract because the Facebook service is entirely free, whereas a consumer contract is premised on payment and consideration. The judge found that there was no obligation placed on users that could be regarded as a form of consideration. The case demonstrates how the provision of personal data is overlooked as an element of the contract between the company and the individual. It's treated as a matter governed by the tangential privacy policies. This lack of transparency regarding the quid pro quo makes it the consumer's sole responsibility to manage their personal information. Concerns that excessive amounts of personal information are being collected can then be met by assertions that people just don't care about privacy. To regard the sharing of personal data as part of a consumer contract for services, by contrast, places both competition law and consumer protection concerns much more squarely in the forefront. In my view, it's time to explicitly address these concerns. Another social harm posed by big data is, of course, discrimination. Oscar Gandy has written about this in his most recent book. We understand how racial profiling leads to injustice in the application of criminal laws. Profiling, whether it's based on race, sex, sexual orientation, religion, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, or other grounds, is a growing concern in how we're offered goods or services. Through big data, corporations develop profiles of our tastes and consumption habits. They channel these back to us in targeted advertising, recommendations, and special promotions. When we search for goods or services, we're presented first with those things which we are believed to want. We're told that profiling is good because it means we don't have to be inundated with marketing material for products or services that are of little interest. Yet there's also a flip side to profiling. It can be used to characterize individuals as unworthy of special discounts or promotional prices, unsuitable for credit or insurance, uninteresting as a market for particular kinds of products or services. Profiling can and will exclude some and privilege others. I've argued that big data alters the data protection paradigm and that social networking services, along with many other free Internet services, are major players in this regard. To conclude my remarks, I'd like to focus on the following key points. First, the collection, use, and disclosure of personal information is no longer simply an issue of privacy, but also raises issues of consumer protection, competition law, and human rights, among others. Second, the nature and volume of personal information collected from social media sites and other free Internet services goes well beyond transaction information and relates to the activities, relationships, preferences, interests, and location of individuals. Third, data protection law reform is overdue and may now require a reconsideration or modification of the consent-based approach, particularly in contexts where personal data is treated as a resource and personal data collection extends to movements, activities, and interests. Fourth, changes to PIPEDA should include greater powers of enforcement for data protection norms, which might include order-making powers and the power to levy fines or impose penalties in the case of egregious or repeated transgressions. And those are my comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll now give the floor for 10 minutes to Mr. Geist.
My name is Michael Geist. I'm a law professor at the University of Ottawa, where I hold the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law. I was a member of the National Task Force on Spam, and I'm currently on the Privacy Commissioner of Canada's Expert Advisory Committee, but I appear before this committee in my personal capacity representing only my own views. My opening comments will identify several areas for potential government action, but I want to provide a bit of context with three key caveats. The first, and I think it may be stating the obvious, is that social media is an enormously important and positive development. The number of users is staggering, and its role as a key source for communication, community, and political activity grows by the day. The opportunities presented by social media should be embraced, not demonized in my view, and government should be actively working to ensure that it incorporates social media into its policy consultation processes. Secondly, Canada has played a leadership role to a certain extent in the use and regulation of social media. The Privacy Commissioner of Canada was the first to conduct a major privacy investigation into Facebook and has led on other issues with respect to social media and Internet companies. Thirdly, while we have had some influence through those investigations, Canada has not led in creating social media services used by millions around the world. I believe that the failure to articulate and implement a national digital economy strategy comes back to haunt us in these circumstances, where the ability to place an unmistakable Canadian stamp on social media is undermined by the policy failure that has done little to encourage the development of Canadian e-commerce and social media. With those caveats, what is there to be done? I'd like to focus on four areas of interest. The first, I think we need to finish what we've started. The government has introduced and even passed legislation that can be helpful in addressing some of the concerns that arise from social media, yet these initiatives have stalled short of the finish line. Anti-spam legislation, for example, received royal assent in 2010, yet has still not taken effect as final regulations have not been approved. In fact, Industry Canada officials now indicate that it could be well into 2013 before the regulations take effect. Given the amount of work that went into this legislation, I find it shocking that it has been left in limbo. Moreover, Bill C-12, the PIPEDA reform bill that seeks changes arising from the 2006 privacy review, continues to lag in the House of Commons, with frankly seemingly no interest to move forward with the bill. Indeed, I'd argue that the bill is even now outdated, and a full PIPEDA review to address emerging concerns such as order-making power, as you just heard, damages, and tougher security breach requirements than those found in the bill is needed. In fact, the Bill C-12 security breach reporting rules are primarily bark with little bite, given the absence of penalties for failure to comply. Successive governments have promised a digital economy strategy for years and have failed to deliver. The strategy has come to be known as the Penske file, a reference to the Seinfeld episode that involves working on an imaginary file. While other countries are now years into implementing their strategies, in Canada we still lag behind. I think it also should be noted that these issues must increasingly be addressed in concert with the provinces. The line between federal and provincial jurisdiction on many of these issues is blurry, and legal challenges against federal legislation is a real possibility. Work is needed to begin to develop minimum standards that can be implemented at the provincial level should federal leadership be challenged in the courts by companies seeking to circumvent their privacy obligations. Secondly, the devil is in the defaults. In many respects, social media and internet companies are the most powerful decision makers when it comes to privacy choices. As my colleague, Professor Ian Kerr, says, the devil is in the defaults. In other words, the choices made by leading social media companies with respect to default privacy settings are the de facto privacy choice for millions of users. Given the increasing pressure to generate revenues, we can expect that those default choices are going to change in more aggressive ways to make use of user data. Now, there are examples of companies that are doing good work in this area. Twitter recently implemented do not track options that won plaudits from the Federal Trade Commission in the United States. Google offers its users transparency tools so that they can obtain detailed information about what information is collected, some of the ways Google uses it, and how they can modify some of their privacy choices. The company's also been transparent about law enforcement requests for information and copyright takedown demands. There needs to be continued work on these defaults, initiatives to provide users with greater information and transparency, and steps to ensure that companies live by their privacy commitments. Thirdly, lawful access. The introduction of Bill C-30 brought with it an avalanche of public outrage and concern over proposed Internet surveillance legislation. While much of the focus was on mandatory warrantless disclosure of subscriber information by telecom service providers, the potential for social media and big data Internet sites to serve much the same purpose cannot be overlooked. A recent investigation by the Privacy Commissioner of Canada into Nexopia, a Canadian social network, identified hundreds of law enforcement requests for customer name and address information, frequently for accounts that should have been deleted months earlier. Social media, as we've heard, generates a treasure trove of personal information that must enjoy full privacy protection and court oversight before disclosure. Indeed, documents that I recently obtained under access to information indicate that public safety is thinking about how these rules are applied to social media sites and services. I believe that Bill C-30 needs to go back to the drawing board to effectively account for these privacy concerns. Fourthly, new legal issues. I think Professor Skaz has identified a number of those, and I would argue that while much can be done to use or augment existing rules, social media and internet sites do raise some unique issues that may require targeted responses. In the interest of time, I'd like to just quickly identify two. First, do not track. As you may know, cookies can be used to trace the web browsing habits of users, including when they visit third-party sites. For example, Facebook inserts a cookie on user browsers that traces your activity as you surf the internet. Any site with nothing more than a Facebook like button, as found on conservative, NDP, and liberal websites, means that Facebook records a visit to that site and retains that information for months. A growing number of sites, including Yahoo, AOL, and Twitter, respect functionality that is found in Firefox browsers that allow users to choose not to be tracked. Google has said it will implement similar technology in its Chrome browser. However, many sites have been slow to adopt Do Not Track, and Facebook has thus far declined to do so. Given the failure of the industry to self-regulate, it is appropriate for government to step in with stronger measures to ensure that this form of user choice is implemented and respected. Secondly, there is a growing problem with social media misuse. For example, in recent months, there have been an increasing number of stories of employers requiring employees to provide their Facebook user ID and password as a condition of a job interview. Seeking the same information with direct questions would typically be prohibited, so this is used as a circumvention of long-standing standards and principles within employment law. In response, the state of Maryland recently passed a law banning employers from requiring employees or job applicants to provide access to their personal digital and social media accounts. Several other states in the United States are working on similar legislation, and I believe that Canada should follow suit. Thanks very much for your attention.
Merci, Mr. Geist.
Thank you, Mr. Geist. Now, our last witness will have the floor. Ms. Steeves, you have 10 minutes.
Very much. I'm the principal investigator of MediaSmart's Young Canadians in a Wired World research project, and we've been collecting data about young people's lived experiences of online privacy for the past 12 years, which coincidentally means we've been collecting data throughout the lifetime of PIPEDA. Over that time, we've tracked significant shifts that I would suggest provide important context for the work that the committee has set out for itself. So I'd like to start my comments with a brief discussion of these shifts and then leave you with 4 specific recommendations. In 2000, when PIPEDA came into force, the idea behind the legislation was that it would develop infrastructural mechanisms that would encourage people to have trust in e-com, so they would participate in this new form of wealth creation. And when it came into force, we sat down and talked to parents and kids. And the parents we talked to actually were very enthusiastic about this project. They had a lot of faith that the internet was going to bring a lot of benefits to their children, and they felt that the companies that were developing these technologies were giving their kids tools to help them deepen their educational experience and also to help prepare them for the marketplace of the future. They also told us that they trusted their kids when they went online to exercise good judgment. You know, they weren't going to watch them all the time. They'd be in the background, figured they'd make a few mistakes, but when their kids got into trouble, they'd come and say, hey, I need some help. When we asked them if they would consider monitoring their children when they were online, they all told us, oh no, that would be a breach of this trust between me and my child. If I did that, I would be invading my kids' privacy, and so I would not do that. Now, for their part, the kids we talked to in 2000 described the net as a completely private space. Adults couldn't even find it, let alone control it. They weren't worried about online privacy in 2000 because they were convinced that they had total anonymity when they were online. Interestingly enough, when they were deciding where to go when they were on the web, they looked for corporate brands because they felt that the companies that owned these brands were trustworthy. They were friends. They could trust them. By 2004, for parents certainly, the internet had gone from being a panacea to a source of family conflict. They were aware that their kids could release personal information online. They knew this was problematic. They had strict rules in the house, just don't do it. But they spent an awful lot of time limiting, managing, and fighting over their kids' online activities. Now, the kids we talked to in 2004 had fully integrated online technologies into their personal lives, and I think this underlines Professor Geist's introductory comments about the benefits of social media. These kids use this media and continue to use these media to try on different identities, to deepen their connections to their real-world friends, and to follow their own interests. In 2004, sometimes they still did this anonymously, but most of the time they wanted to identify themselves because, contrary to popular opinion, they weren't talking to strangers. They were talking to the kids they went to school with, and they needed to identify themselves so they could find their friends when they were online. Even though they knew they could be watched, and they knew they were on a so-called public medium, online privacy was still incredibly important to these kids. And I would suggest to you to be very cautious about any claim that kids don't care about privacy because they post their lives on Facebook. Anyone who says that just hasn't taken the time to talk to kids. They care deeply about online privacy. And it was becoming a growing concern for them in 2004. And in a follow-up survey of 5,500 Canadian school kids, about half of the kids we surveyed were beginning to notice that ads were popping up and were built into the places they went when they went online. Now, fast forward to 2011. Parents now tell us that because kids now go online through multiple points of entry, multiple devices, laptops, computer labs, library networks, iPods, smartphones, iPads, gaming consoles, that it's becoming increasingly difficult to supervise their kids' online activities. But they also told us that it was highly problematic because they needed to supervise more because now releasing personal information is just taken for granted. You go online, that's what you're expected to do. And they were angry at online companies because from their point of view, these companies were just encouraging their kids to disclose everything in order to make a profit. Now, this resentment and this lack of trust is a significant shift from 2000, when high-tech companies were seen to be building a future in which their kids would be empowered through technology. Now, over that same time period, corporate sites, especially those sites targeting children, shifted from talking about privacy to talking about safety. Now, it makes sense from the corporation's point of view, because when I'm talking about privacy, I'm the privacy risk because I'm collecting your information. If I'm talking about safety, I can tell you and your parents that don't worry, I'm keeping an eye out. I'm watching your child and I'll keep them safe. Now, interestingly enough, almost all of the parents we talked to in 2011 were overwhelmed by this discourse of online danger. In fact, the sense of fear was so strong that they argued that good parents can no longer trust their kids and can no longer exercise the benign neglect that was so common in 2000. And again, many of them blamed online corporations. As one Toronto parent said, "I really resent the fear that these companies have instilled in people." All the parents said, I'm not even sure what the dangers are. All I know is that I'm very afraid. I don't want to spy on my kids. That will hurt my relationship with them. But if I have to do it to keep them safe, I will spy on them. For their part, the kids knew it. They told us that that unregulated private space they so enjoyed in 2000 and 2004 is now fully monitored. And they know it's fully monitored by parents, by schools, by their own peers, and by the corporations that own the sites that they visit. Now, this puts kids in a very uncomfortable position precisely because network technologies are so embedded into their social interactions. Interestingly enough, too, the kids said, look, all we need is a space to go out and talk to our friends. We want parents in the background and adults in the background, but we need privacy if we're going to get the benefits of social interaction. And if we can't, then a number of them started talking about getting off of Facebook and getting off of their cell phones because they were under so much surveillance when they were there. And interestingly enough, they all reported that the surveillance they experienced from all of those different people erodes the relationships of trust that are essential to them getting the help they need when they need it. They're also beginning to question what will happen now that employers and police can get access to their Facebook profiles. They also are beginning to worry about what they called, and I'm quoting, the creepy people in the corporation who are watching them. And when you hear kids talk about creeps, creeping, or being creepy, pay attention. That means somebody has overstepped the norms that are associated with exposure and invaded their privacy. It was particularly difficult when corporations did this because when the 40-year-old creep, sent you a message on Facebook, you just blocked or unfriended him, the kids said, we can't do that with the corporations because they own the sites we're on. They also felt that privacy policies were written in totally incomprehensible language on purpose, precisely so companies wouldn't have to reveal what they were doing with their information. So although kids still tend to congregate on corporate sites like Facebook and YouTube, they no longer see online corporations as friendly or trustworthy. And I think that's particularly important to keep in mind because PIPEDA was designed to create that level of trust. So what can we do about it? How can we make it better? I have 4 suggestions for you. First, I suggest that we need to increase the transparency of the business plans behind these sites. In 1999, when a number of us appeared before your predecessor committee, the government talked about PIPEDA being a floor and not a ceiling. As soon as it was passed, it quickly became the ceiling. And I would suggest that there is a great deal of empirical evidence out there that the consent mechanisms that we rely on, end-user license agreements and privacy policies are not being drafted to inform the individual so they can make choices about what they disclose. They're being drafted to protect the organization collecting the information from litigation. In addition, it's becoming increasingly difficult to discover how that information is being used. I want to give you 2 very, very quick examples to illustrate that. In 2000, I did a lot of research on a site called Neopets, which allows kids to create an online pet, and they have to earn points on that site in order to buy their pet products. And they would earn points by filling out market surveys. So in 2000, kids were asked to fill out a survey on breakfast food, for example, and in that context, they were asked additional questions like, How much money do your parents make? Do you have a big house? How many cars are in your family? What kind of cars do your parents drive? They were also asked to identify off a list of 60 interests, things that you might be interested in. And the list included things like beer, liquor, cigars, cigarettes, and gambling. That information was then used to embed advertising into the site to encourage certain kinds of consumption. So I have some idea of the business plan behind that site. Since that time, because of concerns that were raised both in Canada and the United States, those practices have become far less transparent. I can only get access to that kind of information now by snail mail, and if I guarantee to them that I am a corporation. So as a researcher, as a parent, and as a concerned citizen, I'm out of luck. I can't tell you what they're doing with information. It's also become much more difficult to see how this information is being used because collection no longer occurs right in front of you. It occurs in the background. I got a friend request from Facebook. I've never had a Facebook account. I have no relationship with this company. And it said, hey, there's somebody called Melissa Keeshan that you might be friends with, so you should join our network. And they managed, even though I've never had a relationship with them, to track me to my daughter, who never had a Facebook account, even though we don't have the same last name. So I didn't release that information. I have no relationship with that company, and yet they're able to track and try to manipulate my behavior through some business use, which is completely non-transparent. Secondly, I'd urge the committee to not just look at the use of personal information.
I'm sorry, I'll have to ask you to wrap up quickly.
I urge the committee to look also at the uses of aggregate data, because that data is how those profiles that Professor Esgaza was talking about, that's how it runs. Personal information isn't the only privacy problem that we face online. Third, I would suggest that Section 3 of PIPEDA gives you an opportunity to interrogate purposes for which both personal information and aggregate data are used by corporations. And fourthly, often when we have these discussions, the conclusion is we need more education. And after working in privacy education for the last 18 years, I would suggest it's time that we start to take digital literacy education quite seriously. Right now, because the government is not supporting it, you're leaving it by default to corporations. And we need to support public interest organizations so they can provide people with the information they need to make intelligent choices and informed decisions on the Internet. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup et merci aux trois témoins.
Thank you very much to all three witnesses, and now we'll move on to a period of questions and answers to 10 minutes. Mr. Angus.
Thank you, all three. This has been a fascinating discussion. From the New Democratic Party perspective, we see incredible democratic potential and social development possibilities through new media. And the question is how do we strike the balance? Because there are some very disturbing elements that's happening in the world of 2.1 or 2.0, but we need to be careful. This is the thing, is we don't want to overreach and interfere, but we want to ensure protections there. So, Madame Esgaza, I wanted to begin with the issue of which you'd raised it with PIPEDA, because this is our front line of defense. Now, our privacy commissioners pointed out that Canada's falling further and further behind, that we becoming a laggard in terms of the basic privacy protections. And I'm concerned about the issue of the breach reporting requirements, that it seems that the potential rewrite of PIPEDA would allow a very broad interpretation for the companies to decide whether or not they actually have to come forward and tell anybody that their personal privacy has been breached. And they talk about a serious risk. Well, that's a pretty high bar. I can't imagine any company ever willingly going and telling their consumers, guess what, somebody's been hacking your data. Do we need to have mandatory reporting? Do we, and how do you feel the issue of administrative monetary penalties would ensure that these companies actually take the protection of personal data seriously?
Yeah. The two aspects, that the monetary penalties and the issue of data security breach notification. I think the concern with putting some boundaries on the obligation to report security breaches is that they're unfortunately so common and of so many different varieties that if there was an automatic mandatory obligation to report every security breach, that consumers would quickly become overwhelmed and even more distrustful of what corporations are doing with their data, because there can be all kinds of issues or problems. And so I think some middle ground was sought where only the more serious ones that really posed a risk to consumers or individuals would have to be reported. There are different ways that you can do that. I mean, you can leave it to the corporation to determine the seriousness of the breach and whether or not they should be reporting it, or you can have an obligation that corporations report breaches to the privacy commissioner and then decide in consultation with the privacy commissioner what steps should be taken to notify consumers, and there can be a range of different types of notification or different types of responses. And so I'm somewhat sympathetic to the concern about overwhelming consumers with information about breaches, but at the same time I think there are ways to do it that don't leave the decision-making entirely in the hands of companies to determine when a breach presents a serious risk of harm. The concept of serious risk of harm is a difficult one as well, just because it may not always be easy to assess what amounts to a serious risk of harm for individuals. And so I think that's going to be a difficult threshold. As concerns administrative penalties, I think that would be an important weapon in the arsenal of the privacy commissioner. Not only does the administrative penalty impose a sanction on companies, which can be important in signaling that there has been a fault, a lapse in behavior that is problematic and that needs to be addressed, but it also has a more public shaming dimension as well. And I think one of the concerns that's frequently been expressed about PIPEDA is that the Commissioner has taken a very soft approach to dealing with corporations and doesn't name names, particularly in the context of most complaints and so on, and so that there's not enough information provided.
Thank you. We're definitely feeling the need to allow the privacy commissioner to be the adjudicator, because certainly an individual could panic all over any manner of breach without being able to necessarily know the extent of it. But the privacy commissioner certainly represents the public interest and has the ability. Mr. Geist, I'm interested in terms of this idea of falling behind, and Canada was a world leader in terms of digital development. 6-7 years ago, we had some of the highest, penetration rates and access and speed, and it seems like now you look at the OECD standards, we're like bottom third of the pack. You mentioned this, what we're looking at in terms of like a paucity of vision in terms of where we need to go in terms of a broader digital strategy in terms of democratic involvement, in terms of consumer rights, and in terms of economic initiative. Could you explain to us what your concerns are?
Well, sure. I mean, this is an issue that I think most of our peer countries, most of the developed world has identified as absolutely crucial to future long-term innovation and economic prosperity, as well as integral to what our education system looks like, entertainment and culture. I mean, it plays a role in so many different ways, and I think as we've seen over the last number of months, whether through Bill C-30 or SOPA in the United States or ACTA in Europe, the reality is that there's a very important political and participation dimension here as well. And unlike most other countries that have developed digital economy strategies that have focused on everything from ensuring widespread access, bridging the digital divide in terms of just basic access to computers, as well as the digital literacy and skills that Professor Steeves talked about, as well as the policy framework to ensure that we create the right framework to ensure that businesses start here and grow here. What we've seen in Canada is virtually nothing on that front. In fact, there was I think a perfectly good consultation on this a couple of years ago when the Industry Minister Clement was minister. Got a lot of feedback on it. We've seen a lot of other countries that have provided models we could look to, and yet there has been no digital economy strategy put forward. The few legislative initiatives that have been forward, I mentioned one, the anti-spam bill. I mean, literally, we're now sitting 18 months after the bill received royal assent, with still no finalization of the regulations themselves. We've seen things like CAP the community access program, eliminated during the most recent budget at the very time when there was at least an opportunity to look for some private sector leadership. In the United States, you've got efforts between the government and large ISPs to provide low-cost computers, low-cost broadband connectivity to ensure that the poorer parts of our society have access. We don't have any of that taking place in Canada. And so when you come into committee and you start saying, okay, what are some of the big policy issues that we've got to grapple with? Part of the problem is you've got virtually no leading Canadian companies that are imbuing the kind of Canadian values that we're talking about in what they're doing. You've got little leverage in trying to ensure compliance because all of these companies are located outside of the jurisdiction. And while that's not to say that you can't do anything, we've seen that there are some measures that can be taken. We'd be on far stronger ground if, frankly, we just get on with this issue of trying to set out a framework for the future.
Merci. Alors, Monsieur Angus, votre temps est écoulé.
Thank you, Mr. Angus. Your time is up. Mr. Delmastrian, you have the floor.
Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. Very interesting presentations on behalf of all the witnesses today. The Privacy Commissioner appeared on Tuesday, and she said that big data is the currency that Canadians are freely giving away, and without really understanding what it is that they're providing. And Professor Skaza, you indicated, I believe you talked about companies harvesting information about us. I believe that was the term that you used. And Professor Geist, you talked about default privacy settings and the devil being in the details. And Ms. Steeves, I'm actually very surprised that you could receive a friend suggestion through your daughter with a different last name, and you've never been on Facebook. It's pretty remarkable, actually. It demonstrates that there is a whole level of research and information being gathered that I don't think Canadians understand is being gathered. And I think this is when the Privacy Commissioner talks about this currency that's being freely given away, and we talk about things like privacy settings and almost the default privacy settings that are going on. I don't think there's informed consent, and I think this evolves around. I mean, all of our witnesses today are professors of law, and you have a pretty good idea of when you read a disclaimer what it means. Wouldn't it make sense that we started off with something that was very straightforward, take the legalese out of it and say, here's what you're signing up for, and if you don't want these things, click here. Wouldn't that be a good spot to start? I'm interested in what you have to say about specifically informed consent. This idea of tracking, I think, is something that a lot of Canadians would find disturbing.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, I did some research that was funded by the Privacy Commissioner's Office, and the idea was to take the privacy policies that were on a number of sites that kids frequented and take them to them and see if they could understand them. So my research assistant, who is a 24-year-old a university graduate, she's in working on a graduate degree, called me up and she said, hi, can you help me understand what this privacy policy says? It took me about a day and a half, and I'm a lawyer. There were 17 links to 17 different sites. The language was contradictory. Information was missing. It was a phenomenal experience. So when kids say these things are really hard to understand, they are really hard to understand. So what we did is we looked at we took them to kids and they came up with a set of strategies for plain language policies they would find easy to get. And then we looked at the literature, and ironically the kids had come up with exactly the same thing that all the academics had. We rewrote the policies, and then we empirically tested it. We did an experiment. We gave kids the original policies where their comprehension was very low. We gave them the rewritten policies where their comprehension was very high. We published that, and we have 10 best practices available to corporations in drafting privacy policies. They've not been picked up.
Could you provide that to the committee?
Yeah, I can, definitely. It's available online.
Thank you. Mr. Geis?
Yeah, I guess I'm of two minds on some of the stuff. I think that there's no question that there is a necessity to ensure that the kinds of choices and policies that are being put forward are better understood. But quite candidly, I don't think any of these things are designed to be read to begin with. And even if we did have better language, The reality is, given the number of sites that people visit and interact with, given the move towards mobile and wireless environments, the notion that people are going to every time sit and read the privacy policy before they engage in a website, I think is practically unrealistic. More realistic is to set in place some of the mechanisms like do not track to ensure that the choices that people would likely to be making, the reasonable person would say, I'm quite comfortable providing you with a certain amount of information. I mean, and it may be that they're not even aware of the implications of that, but let's take it as a given. The person that uploads a photograph or posts some of their likes or dislikes is doing so with some amount of knowledge that this is being used and distributed to whatever the circle that they may have identified. We have concerns about how that may be misused and aggregated and the rest, but there's some amount of knowledge and choice there. Things around tracking your activity online, so that, as I mentioned, literally all of your political parties have the like buttons. They've got the tweet buttons to make it easy to retweet. And we all like these things because they make it easy for us to tell our network. The reality is, every time you insert that on a website, it actually sends a message back without anything else. As long as you're logged in to Facebook or Twitter, whatever the site happens to be, as long as you're logged in, it's sending a message back to Facebook that that person has now visited that website. I believe that kind of tracking activity goes well beyond, I think, the reasonable expectation of what a user expects. I frankly would be suspicious about any kind of plain language that would make it clear enough for a person to say, yes, this is obviously what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to, for the next 2 months, track every website that I happen to visit and record it so long as they happen to have some sort of Facebook widget included on the page. And so what we need are mechanisms to allow people to more readily, I think, opt out of that. And we have seen some of those mechanisms, but too many of the large players have been reluctant to do so because I think it runs counter to some of their business models. And so that's why there is a role for government, I think, to step up to the plate and say that if you're not willing to self-regulate appropriately here, we're going to do it for you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I largely agree with those comments, both sets of comments. I think the point to underline is that it's no longer just a transaction-based environment where we exchange personal information for a particular transaction. Many of us go online in the morning and stay online all day. We carry around smartphones. Many of us have location enabled on them for various reasons, and that's reporting. And so it just becomes the seamless thing where you've got all of these different programs interacting with each other and data being collected and being shared in contexts where it doesn't even seem where people are so used to using these different programs or applications or interacting in certain ways that to even go to the privacy policies is not a normal or automatic reaction. And yet things are happening that we're not aware of and that we might not consent to were we aware that they were taking place. So I do think that it changes the paradigm, and the legislation needs to respond to that.
Thank you.
That's a small question.
I'm interested in this notion between aggregate and kind of specific statistics. Aggregate statistics, it would seem to me, are kind of what everybody's doing, so it's not necessarily interfering on the privacy of an individual so much as, for example, if Google says people that search for this got given this is their top 10 responses, I don't see that as a privacy invasion. I see that as useful information. But when we get down to specific kind of tracking, I think that's where most Canadians would be concerned. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between aggregate tracking and kind of specific tracking?
Sure.
Je laisserai peut-être une personne répondre.
Perhaps we can just have one quick answer to that.
Well, when you use this data, you're collecting all this personal information, you're tracking population trends, and then you divide everybody up into categories, and then you treat them differently because they belong to a category. So an earlier concern was raised that this type of technology is very important for democratic debate. You can use those categories once someone identifies themselves to change the environment around them. So I was doing research on MSN, and I had not identified myself as any particular person. I was surrounded by the news of the day. As soon as I registered as a 16-year-old girl living in Vancouver, which I was not, you might have guessed, as soon as I did, the news of the day disappeared. It was replaced with celebrity news, dieting ads, and plastic surgery ads, because it wasn't that they knew I was Val, the 16-year-old girl living in Vancouver. they knew I was someone who fit into that category, and therefore there are issues of discrimination that flow from that, as Professor Skaza mentioned, but they're even more insidious because you change the environment around that person because of your assumptions about who they are, what category they fit into. So that would not fall within PIPEDA protections of the use of personal information, but it's highly problematic from a privacy point of view because it fractures public spaces that are necessary for democratic debate, and it opens up vulnerable populations to discrimination.
Merci. Alors,
Thank you. Your time is up now. Ms. Murray, you have the floor for 7 minutes.
For presenting to the committee your ideas about what should be done. So I think what struck me in listening to you is that in some ways we are not, in some ways Canada is falling behind, and at the same time with some of the budget cuts that impedes other organizations from helping sort of slow down that falling behind. And with the incredible complexity of what you've just presented and the potential for different interest groups having different ideas about how to move forward, I'd like your comment on whether our tools as government with laws and enabling those laws and regulations are up to the challenge when we have such a fast-paced and dynamic environment. Or is it the case that what we're trying to bring to bear as Parliament and government just has to be totally rethought if we are to catch up and do something that is in real time with respect to the risks and the concerns? So it's a pretty broad question.
Yeah. I think it is a very challenging environment. One of the things I talked about, and I think that Professor Geis mentioned as well, is that the problems are now so multidimensional and complex that it may be that they can't simply be slotted into one particular box. Data protection legislation in federal jurisdiction. It may be that there are other dimensions that implicate other regimes, whether it's competition law or human rights law, or that implicate the provinces as well. And so it may be that there's a need for a more multidisciplinary, multifaceted approach to some of these issues, that it's not necessarily to our advantage to treat the issues or deal with the issues in specific silos.
Yeah, I guess I've got a couple thoughts. The first is to say that I don't think it's the role of government to come charging in and say we're the new sheriff in town when it comes to social media, and we're going to fix everything that has to do with what these private companies and individuals are, the choices people are making. I think, frankly, it's tough to keep pace with what's happening. As we've heard, we're not even sure necessarily what the business models are. Sometimes we don't know if there is a business model in some of these instances. And so the notion that government knows and is going to fix everything, I think would be foolish, a foolish approach to take. That said, there is unquestionably a role for government and regulators to set certain parameters about what is appropriate and ensure that it reflects, I think, Canadian values about what's right from a privacy perspective, what's right in terms of an obligation from a security perspective, the range of different issues that arise. And in that context, I guess I find myself a bit more optimistic about the prospect that government can engage in that broad rule setting. I mean, PIPEDA, in many respects, was designed, at least initially, I think with the best of intentions, to try to do just that. I think, as Professor Steeves noted, we've now had, about 10 years, more than 10 years of experience, and I think that experience has shown that there is a need for adaptation of the law. So it's not that we're changing something every 10 weeks, but surely every 10 years is enough time to say that there are shortcomings within the legislation on the privacy side that we can fix to ensure that the sorts of broad parameters around some of this activity better reflect, I think, what Canadians expect when they venture online.
Well, I have another associated question, so perhaps, Professor Steeves, you could wind your remarks into both of them. It was mentioned that we're trying to find this balance between privacy and access to data, and it was mentioned how critical this is for business and also the competitive issues that come up. So I'm wondering I'd like to have a comment on the impact on the smaller businesses of what's going on, so not the big data businesses, pro and positive and negative. And I'd also like to know whether there is a country that has a framework for addressing these issues that could be a suitable model for Canada, or whether our situation, whether it's about unique values and principles and situation in Canada, and we basically have to do a made-in-Canada approach. So, thank you.
Well, as was mentioned earlier, online privacy issues are really nested in broader concerns about marketing, citizenship, human rights, social interaction, democracy, democratic dialogue, those types of things. And if you go back to the history of data protection, it was always assumed it would be the last step. That's the floor, not the ceiling approach, that there would be mechanisms where governments would interrogate uses of information and say, is the public interest served by these practices? And if it is, only then we'll go ahead. We'll go ahead with that kind of thing. We'll use fair information practices once the horse is out of the barn to provide some redress in case something happens. And so I think that the reliance on fair information practices perhaps reflects a naivety that it will be enough. It might be a necessary but insufficient condition. I would suggest that jurisdictions that have approached these issues from a broader perspective and come up with solutions that better capture these broader human rights interests are places in Europe, for example, that have a human rights approach to privacy, where there are strong human rights protections for privacy, for inviolability of the personality. So there are a number of situations in Iceland, in Germany, where courts have been able to come up with creative solutions and interrogate those purposes and call those purposes to some form of public judgment through broader understandings. So I agree with what Professor Guy said about consent. Consent is never going to be your solution. I think it's an important piece of the puzzle, but it's a small piece. And we need another mechanism to interrogate these broader purposes. And that's why I pointed you to Section 3 of PIPEDA. It was argued before your predecessor committee we needed Section 3 because that way you could look at purposes and say, well, you know what? That's just not something a reasonable person would consider appropriate in the circumstances. And if it's not, then you shouldn't be doing it. So there's actually quite a power on your part because of that provision to think more carefully about restricting certain uses of information.
I must say that, it's often the questions put, who does it better or who does it best, and can we emulate them? And I have to say that when PIPEDA was first established, I think there was a view amongst many that it was the best practice, that it looked at a lot of what takes place in Europe, it took a look at what had emerged in the United States, and it in many ways tried to bridge the two different approaches. And there can be disagreements over whether there could have been some tinkering here or there, but it genuinely tried to do that. And a number of countries actually looked to Canada as a model for how to, on the one hand, respect some of the privacy views that have come out of Europe, and at the same time reflect some of the business sorts of considerations and enforcement elements that we've seen in the United States. I would say that over the last 10 years, we've really fallen behind. And so we've seen Europe in some ways get more aggressive on some of these issues, and we haven't kept pace. We've seen the U.S., frankly, do a far better job on the enforcement side than we have. There's real penalties there. If you screw up from a privacy perspective in the United States, you're going to pay. They are also the ones that came up with mandatory security breach disclosure requirements, where we see that on states everywhere. And we're seeing it, as I mentioned, on moving towards do not track. We're seeing it with respect to the social media misuse that I referenced as well. And so I think it's about picking and choosing some of the very best that we've seen from an enforcement perspective in the United States, from a values perspective from what we see elsewhere, to create an environment where we're not saying we're like them. We want other countries saying that we're like Canada. And over the last decade, we've really failed to sort of identify what it means to ensure that we've got a privacy legislation that keeps pace with this changing world.
Merci. Alors, votre temps est écoulé, Madame Murray.
Thank you. Your time is up, Ms. Murray. Mr. Butt, you now have the floor for 7 minutes.
Thank you all for being here today. I found your three presentations to be just excellent. My daughters are 12 and 8. My 12-year-old daughter has decided that she, unlike Mr. Angus, likes Twitter, has decided to set up her own little Twitter account, and she does text, and it's mainly her little school chums and stuff. But as a parent, I am concerned about whether there's information that is private, that is going to be accessed in some way, shape, or form. Are you of the view that we can or we should be looking at privacy measures for minors in a different way than we would adults? I mean, should we make the assumption that adults should know better? You know, adults are adults and they should be smarter and they should know better. Should we look at strengthening privacy provisions to protect minors who are users of social media, or should we, in your view, do we just treat everybody the same regardless of their age?
Maybe Val
Sure,
should
I'll
start
take
with
that
this one.
There were recommendations at the first pivotal review to have a tiered consent mechanism that recognized differences in ages. And the suggestion was that beyond, like under a certain age, companies just shouldn't be able to collect any information at all. And then as kids become older, they can opt into programs where they can say, sure, you can have that information and you can flash me a few ads. But it put real restrictions on what they'd be able to do. Probably most importantly, there was a suggestion that once somebody turned 18, there should be a big delete button. So that information was forgotten. Particularly if you look at how kids use technology, they are using it to meet their developmental needs, right? So younger kids, when you talk to 11-year-olds, actually they're the ones who make me the most comfortable. They sound the most mature. Oh, we don't do any of that social networking stuff, certainly not in the broad world, because that's for older kids. And they're very aware of the risks and they manage them quite well. When they hit 13 and 14, they're at a different developmental stage where they're exploring their identities through performativity. So they tend to do outrageous things writ large for a couple of years. Then when they hit 15 to 17, right up to the early 20s, you explore your identity through your social networks. So if you think of it from their point of view, these technologies are fabulous because they give them an opportunity to meet their needs as they become individuals and grow into be adults. I certainly would not want to have to look at anything I wrote when I was 14 in any kind of public environment. And it's quite interesting that so certainly for kids, yeah, I think you need a forget button. There is definitely something different when you're a minor. One of the interesting things that's come out of the research is that there was this belief that these digital natives would be different than us. And ironically, when they hit about 29, they start acting just like you and me. And they use technology the same way we do. They grow up, in other words. So yes, they are different. I share the same concerns about using consent as a mechanism to provide that protection, because you have to identify an age in order for that system to work. And I was launching some research yesterday with a youth panel, and the 11-year-old told CBC all about how all of his 11-year-old friends in grade 6 have Facebook accounts. They know they're supposed to be 13, but they just, click the right button. I think we do a disservice to kids if we say, well, we have to put you under surveillance to make sure you're old enough. That won't help. But certainly having these broader restrictions saying these kids are kids, just don't collect their information. When they get older, don't use it in particular ways. So the Nexopia complaint, for example, Nexopia was the most popular social networking site for kids. And one of the commissioner's recommendations was that they not retain information over a certain period of time, and Nexopia has just said, sorry, we're keeping it. There's a lot of money in this stuff. You're talking 12, 13, 14-year-old kids. So the other thing is the uses that the information is put to. I don't have time to go into any details, but I can point you to some research we're doing with young girls. The site is then embedded with marketing material that uses very stereotypical images, particularly of gender. And I've just done some really fascinating qualitative research with young women, and they talk about how this restricts what they can do, and they're always constantly trying to force it back, and it's actually narrowing the kinds of people they can be rather than broadening up the world for them. So yes, we do have to think about kids differently. I think the way to do that is to look at the uses of the information and just say, hey, it's not reasonable to collect information from 8-year-olds and then use it to try and sell them anything.
Yeah, so Professor Steeves is the expert in this area, so I hate to take a different position, but I have to say that we've seen an attempt to try to target kids from a privacy perspective in the United States with COPPA, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, which sought to have specific protections and essentially parental oversight and consent for kids under 13. This legislation is a joke, right? Because for the very reason that my kids are actually similarly aged to yours, although I have one more, and they're in this world as well. And the notion that they would come, that you know, a company would say, hold on a second, we're not going to collect any of that information until we get your parents' consent, or we're not going to collect anything at all. The truth is there are peer pressures, there's a desire to be there, and frankly, there's an awful lot of good that comes from this environment as well. And so the idea that we can set specific rules that say they're simply not going to collect or they're going to get stronger consents, we've seen that for almost 10 years as a legislative attempt in the United States, and I think, frankly, it fails miserably because the kids are smart enough to know that they can get around it if they want, and the companies will sort of just kind of look the other way as they know it's happening. From my perspective on these issues, we need tough standards that are enforceable. We need real order-making power from the Privacy Commissioner's perspective, the potential for penalties when people overstep, and it applies to all.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure my time must be up. That must be 5 minutes.
1 minute.
Well, that was my main question I wanted to ask. If someone else wants to take the extra minute, I'm leaving committee anyway. So,
sure, I'll just go. Mr. Geist, I was listening to your questions here a little while ago, and one of your comments was a reasonable expectation when it came to it sounded like a legal definition as to what people could reasonably expect, or reasonable expectation that users might have of their personal information and how it might be treated. Is that defined anywhere in the current legislation? Does it need to be defined, or is that definition outdated? Is it outdated in PIPEDA? Is it a case law definition? Could you? Because it just sounded to me like this is some kind of a standard verbiage that's used in the industry, and I'd like some more clarification on that.
It is common language that used, and I think it's highly problematic language. And so it's true that I used it, but I think the notion of relying on a reasonable expectation of privacy, which actually you see crop up very regularly in the cases, in labor cases and other sorts of cases where they talk about, well, what can someone reasonably expect? The problem, of course, is if you've got privacy policies that say you shouldn't expect any sort of privacy, if you've got clear notifications that tell you we're going to collect all the information we can about you and we're going to do absolutely everything we can with it to try to monetize it. They typically don't put it in that straightforward language, but that's essentially what they're often saying. Then you turn around and say, well, what was my reasonable expectation of privacy? And the response is sort of akin to the infamous Sun Microsystems response, you have no privacy, get over it. In that case, you've got no reasonable expectation of privacy because we told you you didn't have any, get over it. And so in setting appropriate boundaries and standards and ensuring that we've got effective tools to enforce those, we get away from the paradigm of saying you only get what you expect and you shouldn't expect everything, to sort of say, no, there are some minimum standards about what's appropriate, and we've got the tools to ensure that they're there and that they're going to be enforced.
Merci. Alors, la minute est écoulée, bien sûr.
Thank you. Your time is up. Ms. Borg, you now have the floor for 5 minutes. Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank our witnesses for coming here today. We've really heard some very interesting testimony, and I think really this is opening up a whole Pandora's box when it comes to the issues related to this study. My first question is for Ms. Steeves. Ms. Steeves, I'd like to ask you this. How does behavioral advertising link to social networks? You mentioned that if you were a 16-year-old, you would be, say, tracked or targeted with advertising that would be different from another age category. So how then does that have an effect on the behavior of these people on the Internet?
With answering that question is a lack of transparency. I would like a lot more information about the business plan behind these sites, and then I would feel more comfortable certainly describing how the back engine works. What I can tell you is what we know about the front engine. There's a lot of research that tracks how people respond to media images around gender, for example. So perhaps the best explanation would be to look at some of the work that's coming out of our eGirls project, another research project that I've been involved in. What young women are telling us is that when they're on these sites, they're surrounded by particular images of very thin, highly sexualized young women who are identified primarily through a relationship with a male. And so for background for our work on that project, we started with an environmental scan. We looked at 1,500 public profiles on Facebook of girls who ostensibly live in the Ottawa area. And those were public profiles. We didn't look at private profiles. Now, of those 1,500, every single one we looked at, with one outlier, reproduced that stereotypical image of gender, okay? Highly sexualized young women with the pouty faces and the bikini shots. All the talk was about the boyfriend. Now, there aren't any quantitative studies that indicate that there's a causal relationship between marketing and behavior like that. There's an assumption, certainly on the part of marketing companies, that the reason you use these marketing images is because you can steer behavior. And they appear to be quite successful at that. What we do know from talking to young people who live in these environments is that these very stereotypical images get in the way. For the young women who embraced them and sought to emulate them, they were wistful in the sense that, gee, if I just can't do it that well, no matter how much I diet, I'll never be that skinny. For the women who wanted to be someone else, they said they constantly had to negotiate with these images and push back against them. And that's driven by the fact that that's the marketing message they're getting. One of the things that's interesting about the trajectory of what's happened in Canada, Michael's right. I mean, we used to be leaders in all sorts of areas, and one of the things we did really, really well was Canada's SchoolNet, and we provided public spaces where kids could talk to each other that weren't commodified, they weren't commercialized. And the federal government got out of that business shortly after PIPEDA was passed. And by default, what we're seeing is a lot of organizations that have kids' best interests in mind are using corporate sites to do things. So, for example, a lot of schools, we did a lot of work with teachers recently, a lot of schools are telling us they use Google Docs. And there's no even acknowledgement that that information can be collected and used and reshaped to manipulate the kids that use that particular platform. You know, frankly, I don't think my kids should be doing their homework in a store. You know? So I think the way behavioral marketing and advertising actually works is it doesn't look like advertising. So if you talk to kids and you ask them what Facebook is, they tell you it's a social network. It's not a social network. It's a research lab. It's designed to collect information about people so we can use it and market back to them. So it's highly effective. We have definitely seen shifts, certainly within my research, about the way that kids respond to these particular images. And I'd point you to all the research that's coming out about, you know, body image problems, the increased use of cutting. There are all sorts of consequences. So I was at a meeting in Edmonton recently where a number of doctors and academics got together because we see this as a health issue.
Je vous remercie. Désolée.
Thank you very much. As you know, I have very little time, so I'll just move on to questions. I think the privatization of the Internet is actually reducing our public space on the Internet, and that's of great concern. My next question is for you, Ms. Gaza. You referred to the fact that we're using safety language rather than privacy language, privacy protection language. So could you speak to that relationship between the social media and the users in terms of privacy versus safety? I'm not sure I fully understood your question. You're talking about the language? You're talking about using safety versus? Well, we're using language that is based on safety as opposed to privacy. So rather than focus the debate on personal information and privacy, we've actually changed that language. So we're talking more about safety now. Yes, that certainly is the case, that there's a considerable amount of concern about the leak of personal information and privacy leaks when it comes to use of information by private companies. And there's the issue of criminalization of activities over the Internet. Now, the focus on privacy and privacy legislation always refers to personal information. But the reality is this. I think we're losing control over that very concept of what personal information implies. We all know that it involves your name, your address, and other personal information, and that can be shared with other people. However, personal information, more and more, involves information about all our activities, everything we're doing on the Internet, and even everything we're doing in other areas. So I think in that context, the emphasis has to be on all that personal information that is being shared. more and more with private companies. I'm not sure if that answers your question. Thank you. Your time is up. So, Mr. Mays, you now have the floor for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. I've really appreciated your input here this morning or this afternoon. One of the things, Mr. Geist, that you mentioned earlier in your presentation was Canadian values, and I kind of see this as a sort of drawing a line in the sand as far as privacy. Like what is privacy to me could be different to others, and I guess that's my question is, you know, there's a consent, but is there a user-specific consent where I'm willing to go so far, but not any further, and that has to be defined by me personally. And that's the challenge I see in putting regulations together is, you know, where do you pick up those Canadian values? Because that term means different things to different people. And so could you just kind of develop that a little bit for me?
Sure. Well, I think you're right. I mean, obviously, many people have different perspectives on some of these issues. I think that there's some low-hanging fruit here. I mean, I think that, you know, if only we were talking about ensuring that there's appropriate respect for people's choices in terms of the kind of consents they give or don't give, and that there's adequate disclosure from organizations that are collecting that information so that people can make informed consent. I mean, if only we started there, and I think you've heard that there is concern that we need to, in some ways, move further along that chain. But even if we just started there, I think it's fair to say that at the moment, Canadian law doesn't do a good enough job. Right, so we don't get the disclosure where there are security breaches with any sort of penalties. We don't have order-making power to ensure appropriate compliance. We don't have penalties where there is insufficient compliance. What we have now, and Val alluded to it, is where a company says, you know, I don't like what you have to say on this, Privacy Commissioner of Canada, they just say, you know, go to court because I'm not even going to abide by that. At the provincial level, we've got provincial commissioners who have order-making power with the ability to enforce. So from my perspective, it's pretty tough to, on the one hand, say we have faith in the privacy commissioner to essentially represent some of the kind of public interest and perhaps the values that I think are broadly reflected within society, and we leave it to that office to adequately enforce. And then you have the commissioner come in here and say, I can't do my job because the rules that you've given me in this situation, it's not you personally, of course, in fact, legislation that dates back more than a decade, that legislation doesn't give me the tool set that I need to adequately enforce, and we've got organizations now that increasingly are willing to push back. I mentioned at in my opening remarks the concern about the blurriness between federal and provincial. But I think, frankly, what we are going to see, especially in light of the securities regulation decision from the Supreme Court of Canada last December, is that absent some real changes in the law, any time the federal commissioner tries to get aggressive about enforcing the rules we have today, you're going to see a company, if they don't like what the commissioner is saying go sue me. They're going to tie it up in the courts for years, and there is a clear risk that the courts may ultimately say either no or say that the law itself is unconstitutional. And so I think that if we did nothing more than saying let's ensure that there's appropriate disclosure and that the consents can be adequately enforced, we'd be miles from where, frankly, we happen to be right now, given some of the shortcomings that we see in the law.
And that's an area that I'm interested in enforcement. Is this like a barking dog chasing the car? You know, are you ever going to catch up to the technology and the way it's used? And that being a challenge. So I guess the question I have is, and maybe I could address this to Mrs. Sakaska, that as far as the enforcement, is it going to be on a complaint basis where how do you enforce these corporations and track them? I mean, the cost of having people to do that is phenomenal. So is it only on a complaint basis that you can really react to this? And could you give me some ideas as far as enforcement of any regulations that we managed to put together here?
Yeah. Well, enforcement, there currently is a complaints mechanism under PIPEDA, but there are also the possibility the Commissioner can conduct audits of companies' information practices, and she has done so on a number of occasions. So there are a number of different powers that you can give to a Commissioner, and so whether it would be audit-making powers or a complaints-based process, the possibility to initiate initiate a hearing or a process on our own initiative, for example, where there appears to be a problem. So there are a number of different ways in which you can do it that doesn't necessarily make it completely complaints-driven. There are problems with complaints-driven mechanisms because they make you respond to the things that people are bringing forward. And as you mentioned, they may involve a significant cost burden. Certainly the volume of complaints has increased over the years. So there are other ways in which the Commissioner can be given powers to react. And we've talked already about the power to issue fines, for example, or to take those kinds of extraordinary measures in specific cases. So I think the menu of options is quite broad, and there can be multiple options in any piece of legislation. There can be a range of different powers depending on the circumstances and depending on the particular norm or concern.
Merci. Alors, votre...
Thank you. Your time is up, Mr. Mays. And I'll now give the floor to Mr. Boulris for 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'll take a few minutes to thank you not only for being here today, but also to thank you for the quality of your remarks and the answers you've provided to our questions. This is extremely interesting, and it's actually fascinating. The topic itself is fascinating, and what you're saying is so relevant. Several years ago, I was struck, like many others were, by George Orwell's 1984 novel, in which this all-powerful government becomes a big brother who's all-seeing and supervises our every movement. And I think we're describing a similar situation. I mean, the government could be somewhat of a big brother. The Conservatives have brought forward C-30. And I have a feeling that we're stuck with medium brothers. And those are these big companies on the Internet who are perfectly able to know about us, know what we like, what we're buying, what we're not buying, what we don't like, what we're interested or not interested in, and who then can act accordingly. Do you have that? Is that your impression, that social media and the Internet have sort of become a collection of big brothers? I think often the film that is quoted, as well as Orwell's novels, is Minority Report with Tom Cruise. And that advertising that changes depending on who's watching that advertising. Certainly it is true that we are being watched by corporations to a greater and greater extent. But I would point this out, and that is that the information that's being collected by these corporations about our activities and our habits and the areas we're going to are actually accessible to the government as well. There are provisions in the privacy legislation that provides for the ability for corporations to choose to share that information without the consent. In the case, for example, of a court case or an investigation by the authorities. And that is something that we're seeing more and more. And it's something that was mentioned by my colleague, Professor Geist, today. So we are, yes, being watched by companies and also in cases where government has access to that information. So I think that that is something that should be noted and understood. Thank you. Does anyone else have a comment they'd like to add?
I want to harken back to the very first caveat, and that is to emphasize just how important and valuable these services are. And so I recognize the language around Big Brother and social media, but I have to say that the value that's associated with this, as I mentioned, for so many different purposes, from community to activism to culture to education, is very, very important in a way that if we start calling this Big Brother in that sense, I think puts clearly a negative spin. I do think Professor Skaza's point is absolutely crucial. It's one of the reasons that I referenced it in my opening remarks. 10 years ago, the big fear amongst many in the privacy community was about countries like the United States creating these large all-knowing databases. They went by terms like echelon or carnivore or total information awareness, TIA. I don't think the government, to the best of our knowledge, we don't know if the government ever was able to create that in the United States. But in a sense, databases much like that have effectively been created by the private sector, as many of us actually actively gave that information up to those companies, and in many instances, as I mentioned, have obtained, I think, real value out of that. The danger that we face is that the kinds of limits and legislation that we had within the Privacy Act that might set limits on what government can do with the information that it collects have not been established in the same way with respect to information that is collected by the private sector and then accessed by government. Effectively, it is a circumvention or an end around the very rules that government has imposed on itself to allow law enforcement and others to collect from third parties and do with information that third parties have collected that it legally is otherwise unable to collect or do.
Okay, merci. Le temps file.
Thank you. My time is running out quickly here. I'm not against social media. I love Facebook. And I love Twitter. And it gives me an opportunity to keep up with the news and to share videos, information, photos, etc. But this is my question. I'll try to do it quickly. On the business model. A few years ago, I remember on the private television network, a CEO had said, my job is to be able to sell available brain time to Coca-Cola. So his business is actually to bring viewers to watch advertising. So when you buy a newspaper, if you think you're just buying articles, you're not just buying articles. You've just sold part of yourself, actually, to the advertisers within that newspaper. So perhaps Facebook and Twitter and Google, even though we use them and we love them, people have to be aware that they're actually giving their information, their personal information, to a company that will afterwards deal with other industries who will want to be able to sell that information in order to be able to shape and target their advertising. Am I right?
As far as we know, the business model for many of these companies, and I think for many of them they are evolving, shall we say, is to leverage the information, the social graph that they're able to accumulate, and add value to that for marketers or others. There's no question that that's the model. That isn't, in my view, per se bad. I mean, there is a lot of value that comes out of this environment. The danger comes where we engage in, as I talked about earlier, things like social media misuse, or the collection of information that I think in many ways feels somewhat surreptitious, where people are unaware of what's taking place. They're being tracked in ways that isn't voluntarily providing information in the way that we typically think of as I enter in a bunch of fields on a computer screen and say, or upload some pictures and say, here this is. In fact, it's other kinds of activities actively being tracked and used in much the same way you've just described.
Merci, malheureusement, le temps est écoulé.
Thank you. Your time is now up, and I'll give the floor to Mr. Drishin. 5 minutes.
Chair, and thank you so much for coming today. It's just I was listening to or watching a television ad just a short time ago where someone with their cell phone had been able to look at the speech that was being presented by a coach as he was in front, talking to his teammates, and they talked about how great it was that they were able to just move that thing down to the YouTube and bring it right into the school so that they could cheer them on. And I think what you just mentioned a few moments ago about the social media misuse. Obviously they looked at it from that perspective and said, yeah, isn't this great? But I think you're taking a look at the other side of it as well. And, I think I was a school teacher, for many years. And, so thinking back to when I went to university, it was always be nice to be able to get somebody else's notes if you didn't make it to class or whatever. But here it's just a case of why don't you just tape what's going on and you can send it to your friends. So then I started looking at, well, what about the propriety of what is being produced by the instructor and all of these other types of things and the types of protection that you have. Now that may or may not be associated with privacy as what we're speaking of today, but nevertheless, it's one of those kinds of things that people have to be aware of. And then that means that institutions have to start bringing up certain rules and in schools where you say, well, you're not going to be able to go on Facebook or you're not going to be able to bring your cell phones or anything else into the classroom. So those are the kinds of things that I see. So when we try to bring some policy and some thought together on this, I think your comments on that would be something that I'd appreciate.
Okay. As part of the Young Canadians Project, we talked to 10 key informant teachers across the country, so I actually have good data on this. They perceive it as a privacy issue because when the walls of the classroom become transparent, you lose the ability to create a safe space where kids can make mistakes and explore and learn effectively. In addition, there are all sorts of problems that happen when kids surreptitiously monitor or take tapes of the of what's happening on in the classroom and post it online. It changes the dynamic significantly. Uniformly, the teachers we talk to all indicate that the solution is not to get rid of the technology. And in fact, that's been our knee-jerk reaction. Oh, we don't like this. Let's just shut it down. Social networking and these types of tools can really deepen kids' education, and I have a report of incredible best practices to justify that. However, what they told us is that the real problem is that the schools are taking that approach and they're banning things. And if they do allow kids to go online, they place them under total surveillance. And by doing that, they also place the teachers under surveillance. And what that does is it shuts down the opportunity to be that caring adult beside the kid when they do run into trouble or say, hey, this looks like a kind of wingy site, and then the teacher can go over and go, yeah, that's a hate site. So those teachable moments where we can give kids true digital literacy skills are shut down by not embracing the technology. So, but at the same time, I would stress it is a privacy issue.
And I see this as the use of these tools, particularly for education purposes, have a tremendous amount of potential. I mean, this particular hearing is not only being viewed, but took a quick glance, and there are people tweeting about it as they listen or watch in real time. I mean, the classroom isn't just the classroom that we tend to think of, let's say, at the University of Ottawa. This is, in a sense, a classroom where others have the opportunity to watch, to listen, to interact, and to engage. I think there's great opportunities there. I think one of the things that government ought to be thinking about in there is how do we better facilitate the use of these sorts of tools and technologies to bring the educational opportunities to as many people as possible. I think, for example, Bill C-11, the copyright bill, did some of those things, but at the same time, there are distance learning provisions in there that require, as you may know, teachers to destroy lessons that are used under that particular exception within 30 days. To me, that's a most unfortunate provision in there, one that I think actually shifts us in the wrong direction when we start talking about the kinds of the way that we use these tools in furtherance of ensuring better education, better educational opportunities, and frankly, ensuring that more people have access to this, not less.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I think that there is enormous potential for creativity, for dynamism, for reaching learners with different styles and different abilities, and for bringing information and resources to the classrooms. So there is tremendous potential there. What I see, and this is purely on an anecdotal basis as a parent, is not a lot of guidance coming from the schools, not a lot of information. My 10-year-old daughter brought home an acceptable computing use form that she had to sign before she could go to the computing lab, and it had things like, I agree that I will not engage in copyright infringement. I asked her if she understood what copyright infringement was or what activities would constitute. She has no idea. There are plenty of adults who have absolutely no idea. And then I said, has anyone at the school talked to you about it? No. So there's just not a lot of dialogue, and I think the role of government in those contexts, perhaps, is, as has been mentioned already, is to facilitate education, to provide resources, or to provide them opportunities to community groups and other organizations to carry out these functions. I mean, there's a richness of opportunity, but I think there's also a paucity of information and education.
Merci. Alors, votre temps est écoulé.
Thank you. Your time is now up. We have to move on to future business shortly, so I'll give 2 minutes to Mr. Angus and then 2.5 minutes to Ms. Davidson, and then we'll wrap up. Mr. Angus, you have 2 minutes.
Fascinating discussion, and I certainly think we always got to keep the potential, the democratic involvement of new media is very transformative. My concern is about the issue of function creep. It's this notion that we're hearing around the table, well, if someone signs an agreement, or, well, you make your consent. Well, you consent for a specific piece of information that you share, and yet that information is then reshared and reshared into this vast data mine. And this is, I guess, the question of privacy rights that has to be clarified when we are signing on to something. My daughter in grade 9 the other day emailed me and said, I'm not allowed onto my Gmail account unless I give Google my cell phone number. And I thought that was really odd, and then I phoned her and I said, what happened? She said, well, I couldn't get my Gmail unless I gave Google my cell number. And then the next day, my Gmail account came up, and it said, please put your cell phone in for greater security. I didn't want to give my cell phone. My grade 9 daughter is smarter than me. I wasn't going to give hers. But you had to look down at the bottom of the page for a very small thing to say, click if you don't want to do this. So when you looked at it, they were asking my 14-year-old daughter to give them her cell number. Now, Google is a great corporate citizen, but she didn't sign on to Gmail to give them her cell phone information. So I guess in this question of function creep, what role do we have to say, wait a minute, that's beyond the pale, and are you going to use this cell phone number of a teenage girl strictly for security, for her personal security, or is this going to be added into the vast data mine that someone else is going to be able to access? I think these are questions that we have an obligation to ask as legislators.
If I can make just one quick comment. If you look at identity theft, typically the solution is always give me more of your information so I can make sure it's you, which just creates more leaks, which just increases the risk that that information will flow and be used against you. So to call it a security measure is kind of funny.
Yeah. I mean, I think to just go back to a point that was made earlier, that I think the notion of transparency is an incredibly important one, because people aren't necessarily aware that that piece of data that they give consent to in one context, or that they may not have realized, they've given a certain consent, but they may not have realized the scope of that consent. They may not realize the nature of the bargain between them and the free company. A lot of people don't realize that Gmail is scanned to extract personal information, and that's part of the bargain with Gmail. So there's a lack of transparency at that end. There's also a lack of transparency at the other end when you go on a website, and Professor Steeves has described a number of contexts where you're presented with advertisements when you go to read the paper, or you go to MSN, or you go wherever. And there's also, I think, a lack of transparency. People don't necessarily realize that what they're seeing is different from what other people see, and that there's a reason for that. And so I don't know if that's partly a norm setting, and we've also talked about, setting boundaries and not just letting everything be carried by the consent model, but actually setting some norms or boundaries, which I think is a positive thing. And then there's the increasing transparency dimension of the problem, whether that's greater public awareness or obligations on companies to do more, to be more transparent.
Peut-être 30 secondes à M. Geist, rapidement.
Very quickly.
30 seconds to Mr. Geist.
Actually, address the issue of that we've been hearing about, this notion that we think you're someone and perhaps that you're not that person. So, for example, even Google gives you the ability. It's actually quite striking when you do it. You can go in, and Google has a section there. Well, they'll tell you who they think you are. And what you like based on all the information they've been able to call. Now, you can have them turn that off if you want. You can also tell them that actually you've got it wrong. Here is actually who I am, because what I want to see is stuff that better reflects some of my interests. Now, some people say, I don't want to tell them who I am and some of my interests. Other people will say, I'd rather see that sort of stuff. But my point is that there are companies out there that are thinking about some of those sorts of issues. If we can get the right framework with the right incentives from a regulation perspective, I think that there's some good opportunities here.
Merci. Alors, la dernière question revient.
Thank you. Ms. Davidson, you have the last question for 2 minutes.
Mr. Chair, my question is going to be to Professor Steeves, and I certainly was very interested in the research that you've done on children's privacy, and I've got 2 or 3 questions. I'll ask them, and then I'll let you address them if you can. First of all, do we have access to the study? What ages were the children that you did the research on? And then how do you define personal or private information when you were talking to these kids? We've had a very, very high incidence of suicide in my riding with young people. And I just spoke with a very concerned, distraught parent this week whose daughter was 14 years old and had threatened suicide, had not committed suicide, thank goodness. But it came down to where the parent was thoroughly convinced that it was because of social media that had tipped the balance that caused the worst threat to this child. And it was over release of information that was going broadly across the community and the school of things that she felt was personal. Could you just comment on those questions, please.
Very quickly, this study was conducted with children between the ages of 11 and 17 and parents with kids of those ages. It's available online, and I'm happy to make it available to the committee. We also collected a lot of data about cyberbullying, and that's what you're alluding to, that in this environment, people can say things, kids take it the wrong way, they lose control. Our data actually suggests the opposite. The kids we talked to indicated that cyberbullying is easier to deal with than real-world bullying because it leaves a paper trail. So you can point and you can say, see, she said that, and you can go to adults and get some help. They were well aware of the fact that kids are more likely to say things that they are a little bit more outrageous because it's not face-to-face, but they said, well, that's easy. You can just confront them face-to-face, and if not, then you go and you get a parent. That's when you need help from your parents. So there isn't a lot of empirical evidence to support the position that this form of bullying is actually exacerbating suicidal tendencies. There is evidence to suggest it's the opposite. It's actually easier to deal with. What we did get very, very clearly from the kids, and you'll see that if you look at the report, is that their school's response to bullying has been to use zero-tolerance policies and total surveillance. What that means is they can't go to the school. They can't go to the teacher, even if it's a teacher they trust, because they know the principal will be called in, and then it will go, and the cops will be called in, and they'll lose control. So in many ways, we're overreacting to a particular problem and not giving them the support that they need precisely because we're trying to protect them.
Merci. Alors, ça conclut
Thank you. That concludes our testimony for today. I'd like to thank you for coming and appearing before us. I hope we'll have an opportunity to see you again, and I'm sure your testimony will be helpful in this committee's deliberations. We'll suspend now for a few minutes. Just before we do, I would like to recall that there are two documents that are going to be circulated to the members that were raised by Ms. Steeves. You can just send that to the clerk, and then we'll make sure that all members of the committee have access to that. We'll now suspend for a few minutes and come back for committee business.
Alors, on va reprendre juste...
We'll begin again, but I would just like to point out to members that the Privacy Commissioner tabled her bulletin or report card. So I just wanted to let you know. If you're interested in seeing them, they're available. And the other point, I believe Mr. Del Mastro wanted to take the floor.
We're now in committee business, Mr. Chair. I just moved, the committee moves in camera.
Alors, cette motion n'est malheureusement pas...
This, unfortunately, is a non-debatable motion. So I would like a recorded vote, please. A recorded vote. The clerk will now take a recorded vote. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The question is that the committee sit in camera.
Mr. Calkins. Yes. Ms. Davidson.
Yes.
Mr. Del Mastro.
Yes.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Yes.
Mr. Mays.
Yes.
Mr. Angus.
No.
Mme. Borg.
Non.
Mr. Bourris.
Niet.
Mr. Collard.
Non.
Alors,
Un socialiste qui parle russe, c'est bon, ça. Oui, Kovalich.
aux gens de la télévision.
And I would ask the cameras to be turned off at this point.